Hey everyone, today we dive into one of the most chilling and fascinating crime stories in American history, a story of Charles Manson and his followers who shocked the world with their brutal murders in the Hollywood Hills. What's going on, everyone? Today we uncover the dark psychology and twisted events behind one of the most notorious criminal cases that forever changed how we think about cults, celebrity, and violence in America. Welcome back. Today we explore the sinister web of manipulation that led to the Manson family murders. The incredible story of how one man's delusions turned a group of young people into killers is stranger than any fiction Hollywood could create. What really happened during those terrifying nights in August 1969, when the lives of innocent people were brutally cut short by followers who believed they were starting a race war? The unbelievable events surrounding Charles Manson and his so-called family reveal the darkest corners of human psychology and the dangerous power of charismatic manipulation. Everything you think you know about the Manson murders is about to change as we explore not just what happened, but how a failed musician from Ohio convinced a group of mostly middle-class young people to commit acts of unspeakable violence. You won't believe what actually happened in the months leading up to these murders, and how close Manson came to escaping justice entirely. The real story of the Manson family is more complex and terrifying than the sensationalized versions you might have heard. So before we dive in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now get comfortable, grab something to drink, and let's experience this incredible story together as we journey into one of the darkest chapters in American criminal history and understand how ordinary people can be transformed into instruments of violence. Picture this scene. It's August 8, 1969, in Benedict Canyon, one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in Los Angeles, where the wealthy and famous live behind gates and security systems, believing themselves safe from the chaos of the outside world. The Polanski residence at 10050 Cielo Drive sits perched in the hills, a beautiful home that should have been a sanctuary, but on this night would become the site of one of the most shocking crimes in American history. Sharon Tate, the 26-year-old actress and wife of director Roman Polanski, is 8.5 months pregnant and hosting friends for what should have been a quiet evening while her husband works in London on a film project. The house is filled with the kind of people you'd expect in Hollywood circles. Jay Sebring, the famous hairstylist who had once dated Sharon and remained a close friend, Abigail Folger, heiress to the Folger coffee fortune, who was dating Wojtek Frykowski, a Polish writer and friend of Polanski's who was staying at the house. These were successful, creative people living the California dream in the summer of love, completely unaware that four strangers were making their way up the winding canyon road with orders to commit what their leader called helter-skelter. But to understand how we arrived at this moment of horror, we need to travel back to Cincinnati, Ohio, in November 1934, where Charles Mills Manson entered the world under circumstances that would shape every aspect of his twisted personality. His mother, Kathleen Maddox, was barely 16 years old, an alcoholic who frequented bars and had a series of chaotic relationships with men who drifted in and out of her life like ships passing in a storm. She named her son after Colonel Walker Henderson Scott, a man she was dating at the time, though that relationship would end long before Charles could form any memory of the man he was supposedly named after. Kathleen was the product of a dysfunctional family herself, raised by strict religious fundamentalists who filled her childhood with fire and brimstone sermons about sin, damnation, and the approaching end times. When she rebelled against this oppressive environment, she swung to the complete opposite extreme, embracing a lifestyle of drinking, promiscuity, and petty crime that left no room for the responsibilities of motherhood. Young Charles became an unwanted burden that she would frequently abandon with relatives, neighbors, or anyone willing to take him while she pursued her self-destructive lifestyle. The pattern of abandonment began when Charles was just 3 years old and his mother disappeared for days at a time, leaving him with his aunt and uncle, who were devout Nazarenes that subjected him to hours of religious indoctrination about the wickedness of the world and the divine punishment awaiting sinners. These early experiences with apocalyptic Christianity would later merge with his own psychotic delusions to create the twisted theology that he would use to justify mass murder. The constant religious rhetoric about Judgment Day, the battle between good and evil, and the chosen few who would survive the coming apocalypse became deeply embedded in his developing psyche. When Charles was 5 years old, his world collapsed completely when his mother and her brother were arrested for armed robbery of a Charleston, West Virginia gas station. Kathleen was sentenced to 5 years in prison, and Charles was officially placed in the care of his grandmother and aunt, but the damage to his emotional development had already been done. He had learned that the people who were supposed to love and protect him would inevitably abandon him, and he began developing the manipulative strategies that would become his most dangerous weapons as an adult. Here's where the story gets really disturbing because, even as a young child, Charles displayed all the classic warning signs of what psychologists now recognize as psychopathy. He tortured animals with a methodical cruelty that went far beyond normal childhood misbehavior, once crucifying a cat and setting dogs on fire while watching their suffering with fascination rather than empathy. He stole constantly, not just for things he needed, but for the thrill of taking what belonged to others, and the sense of power it gave him over his victims. But what made young Charles truly dangerous was his precocious understanding of human psychology and his ability to manipulate adults with fake tears, elaborate sob stories, and an uncanny talent for telling people exactly what they wanted to hear. Social workers and teachers noted his unusual charm and intelligence, but they also documented disturbing incidents of violence and manipulation that suggested something fundamentally wrong with his emotional development. He would convince adults to trust him and then betray that trust in spectacular fashion, often stealing from the very people who had tried to help him. The reformatory system that was supposed to rehabilitate Charles instead became his graduate school in manipulation and violence. At the Gibble School for Boys in Indiana, he was repeatedly sexually abused by older students and staff members, experiences that taught him that power and control were the only ways to avoid being victimized. He learned to identify the weakest targets and exploit their vulnerabilities while simultaneously charming authority figures into believing he was making progress toward rehabilitation. Now, to understand how Manson developed his sophisticated techniques for controlling people, we need to examine his time at the Federal Reformatory in Chillicothe, Ohio, where he encountered a copy of Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People. He studied this book with the intensity of a graduate student, taking detailed notes and practicing the techniques on fellow inmates and staff members. But unlike Carnegie's intended purpose of building genuine relationships, Manson perverted these principles into tools for manipulation and control. He also discovered the writings of L. Ron Hubbard and became fascinated with Scientology's techniques for psychological manipulation and mind control. He learned about auditing, the process of breaking down a person's psychological defenses through repetitive questioning, and incorporated these methods into his own approach to recruiting and controlling followers. The combination of Carnegie's influence techniques and Scientology's mind control methods created a powerful toolkit that Manson would use to devastating effect on his future victims. During his various incarcerations throughout the 1950s and early 1960s, Manson also became obsessed with pimping and studied the methods that successful pimps used to control their prostitutes. He learned about breaking down a woman's self-esteem, isolating her from support systems, creating emotional dependency, and using a combination of violence and affection to maintain control. These techniques would later become central to his method of recruiting and controlling the young women who would form the core of his family. What they discovered about Manson's prison years reveals a pattern of escalating manipulation and violence that should have been recognized as extremely dangerous. But the overwhelmed and understaffed correctional system failed to understand the threat he represented. He was involved in numerous assaults, escape attempts, and schemes to manipulate staff and inmates. But he was also skilled at presenting himself as reformed and ready for rehabilitation when it served his purposes. The story takes a crucial turn in March 1967 when Manson was released from Terminal Island Federal Prison and found himself in the middle of the Summer of Love in San Francisco. He was 32 years old and had spent more than half his life in institutions, making him completely unprepared for life in normal society, but perfectly equipped to prey on the thousands of young people who were experimenting with drugs, alternative lifestyles, and spiritual seeking. The hippie movement provided him with the perfect cover for his predatory behavior, as his manipulation techniques could be disguised as spiritual guidance and his control methods as creating a loving family. His first victim was Mary Brunner, a 23-year-old graduate student and librarian at UC Berkeley who lived alone in a small apartment and was hungry for the kind of intense attention and affection that Manson specialized in providing. He seduced her with a combination of philosophical discussions, sexual attention, and promises of a deeper spiritual connection than she had ever experienced. Within weeks, he had moved into her apartment and begun the process of isolating her from her friends, family, and previous life, while convincing her that their relationship was special and that she needed to help him gather other lost souls who could benefit from his wisdom. Brunner's transformation from independent graduate student to devoted follower demonstrates the insidious nature of Manson's recruitment process. He didn't simply brainwash people overnight. Instead, he used a gradual process of love bombing, isolation, and psychological manipulation that made his victims feel like they were choosing to follow him rather than being coerced. He convinced Brunner that her education and middle-class background had been programming by a corrupt society, and that only by abandoning her previous identity could she discover her true self and purpose. But here's what makes Manson's recruitment strategy so effective and terrifying. He specifically targeted individuals who were emotionally vulnerable, often from broken homes or dealing with unresolved trauma that made them susceptible to his particular brand of manipulation. Susan Atkins had been sexually abused by her father and had a history of running away from home and working as a topless dancer, making her desperate for the kind of father figure and protector that Manson pretended to be. Patricia Krenwinkel had grown up feeling invisible and unloved in her conventional middle-class family, and Manson convinced her that she was beautiful and special in ways that no one had ever recognized before. Leslie Van Houten's story is particularly tragic because she had been a homecoming queen and honor student whose life was derailed by her parents' bitter divorce and a traumatic abortion at age 17. She turned to drugs and alternative lifestyles as a way of coping with her emotional pain, making her the perfect target for Manson's promises of unconditional love and acceptance within his family. He understood exactly how to exploit her guilt and shame about her past, while positioning himself as the only person who could truly understand and forgive her. The recruitment of Charles Tex Watson reveals another dimension of Manson's manipulation techniques, because Watson wasn't a vulnerable young woman seeking a father figure, but a former college athlete and honor student who had gotten involved with drugs and was searching for meaning and purpose in the chaotic landscape of 1960s counterculture. Manson appealed to Watson's sense of masculine identity by positioning him as a trusted lieutenant and eventual heir to his power, while simultaneously breaking down his moral boundaries through constant exposure to violence and criminal activity. Each new recruit went through the same systematic process of psychological conditioning that began with love bombing and gradually escalated to complete control over every aspect of their lives. Manson would shower new followers with attention and affection while telling them they were special and chosen, different from the sheep who blindly followed society's rules. He would share intimate details about his own troubled past and encourage them to open up about their own pain and trauma, creating a false sense of intimacy and trust that he would later exploit for his own purposes. The next phase involved introducing his philosophy and worldview, which combined elements of Christianity, Scientology, racist ideology, and his own grandiose delusions about his role in world history. He taught his followers that he was Jesus Christ returned to earth to lead the chosen few through the coming apocalypse, and that traditional morality was a tool used by the establishment to keep people enslaved. He convinced them that murder, theft, and other crimes were not only acceptable, but necessary for their spiritual evolution and the salvation of humanity. Life at Spawn Ranch became a carefully orchestrated environment, designed to break down individual identity and replace it with complete devotion to Manson and his mission. The followers lived in primitive conditions without privacy or personal possessions, sharing everything from food to sexual partners according to Manson's directives. He controlled when they ate, slept, worked, and had sex, creating a state of constant dependency that made independent thought and action increasingly difficult. The use of drugs was central to Manson's control strategy, but he was careful to maintain his own sobriety while keeping his followers in a constant state of altered consciousness. He would dose them with LSD without their knowledge, often mixing it into their food or drinks, then use their altered states to implant suggestions and reinforce his control over their thoughts and perceptions. The combination of sleep deprivation, malnutrition, drug use, and psychological manipulation created a perfect storm of conditions that made his followers increasingly susceptible to his influence. What really happened during the months leading up to the murders was an escalating campaign of violence and criminal activity that served as training for the ultimate acts of terror that Manson was planning. The family was involved in numerous burglaries, assaults, and acts of vandalism that were designed to desensitize the followers to violence and test their willingness to follow orders without question. Manson would stage mock executions and torture sessions, forcing his followers to participate in increasingly extreme acts of cruelty that gradually eroded their moral boundaries and empathy for other human beings. The Beatles' White Album, released in November 1968, became the soundtrack to Manson's apocalyptic delusions and provided him with the perfect tool for convincing his followers they were part of a cosmic plan that had been prophesied in popular music. He spent hours analyzing the lyrics to songs like Helter Skelter, Blackbird, Hibbies, and Revolution 9, explaining to his followers how these songs contained coded messages about their mission and the coming race war that would destroy American society. Manson's interpretation of the Beatles' music was completely delusional and based on his own racist worldview and megalomaniacal fantasies about his importance in world events. He believed that the Beatles were communicating directly with him through their songs, warning him about the approaching racial apocalypse and instructing him on how to prepare for his role as leader of the post-war world. He taught his followers that Helter Skelter was a prophecy about Black Americans rising up to kill all white people, and that Blackbird was a call for African Americans to begin the revolution that would ultimately put Manson in power. But here's where Manson's delusions become even more twisted and revealing of his deep-seated racism and narcissism. He believed that Black people were inherently inferior and would be incapable of governing themselves after winning the race war, which meant they would eventually turn to him and his family for leadership. In his fantasy, he and his followers would hide in a bottomless pit in Death Valley during the violence, then emerge to rule over the Black survivors who would be grateful for white guidance in managing civilization. This racist mythology combined elements of Christian apocalyptic thinking, Nazi ideology about racial superiority, and science fiction fantasies about underground civilizations to create a belief system that justified any violence committed in service of the coming revolution. Manson convinced his followers that they were the chosen people who would inherit the earth after the destruction of corrupt modern society, and that their actions were part of a divine plan that transcended ordinary human morality. The process of turning his followers into killers involved systematic desensitization to violence and the complete destruction of their capacity for moral reasoning and empathy. Manson would force them to torture animals while he watched, explaining that these acts were necessary preparation for the greater violence that would be required during Helter Skelter. He staged elaborate scenarios where followers would be forced to choose between betraying their friends or facing punishment themselves, gradually breaking down their loyalty to anyone except him. Now, what most people don't understand about the Manson family murders is that they weren't the result of sudden madness or drug-fueled violence, but the culmination of months of careful planning and psychological preparation that involved multiple practice runs and escalating acts of brutality. The murder of Gary Hinman in July 1969 served as a dress rehearsal for the larger crimes to come, allowing Manson to test his followers' willingness to torture and kill while following his specific instructions about how to stage the crime scene. Gary Hinman was a gentle music teacher and part-time social worker who had befriended several members of the Manson family and had been generous with his time and resources in trying to help them. Manson targeted him because he believed Hinman had inherited money that could be used to fund the family's activities, and because he wanted to test whether his followers were truly ready to kill for the cause. Bobby Beausoleil was sent to Hinman's house with instructions to get the money by any means necessary. But when Hinman insisted he had no inheritance, Beausoleil held him prisoner for 3 days while torturing him and calling Manson for further instructions. The torture of Gary Hinman reveals the methodical cruelty that Manson had instilled in his followers and their complete willingness to inflict suffering on someone who had shown them nothing but kindness. Beausoleil and the women who accompanied him took turns beating Hinman, cutting off his ear and demanding money that didn't exist, while Hinman begged for his life and tried to reason with people he had considered friends. When Manson finally gave the order to kill Hinman, Beausoleil stabbed him twice in the chest and then used his blood to write "Political Piggy" on the wall, following Manson's instructions to make the murder look like the work of Black revolutionaries. The selection of 10050 Cielo Drive as the target for the most infamous murders wasn't random, but was based on Manson's personal grudge against Terry Melcher, the record producer and son of Doris Day, who had previously lived at the house. Melcher had briefly considered recording Manson's music after being introduced to him by Beach Boys drummer Dennis Wilson. He ultimately decided against it after recognizing that Manson was dangerous and unstable. This rejection wounded Manson's enormous ego and convinced him that the music industry establishment was part of the corrupt system that needed to be destroyed. Manson had visited the Cielo Drive house several times when Melcher lived there, often showing up uninvited with his followers and making Melcher increasingly uncomfortable with his bizarre behavior and veiled threats. The house represented everything that Manson felt he had been denied by society, and the wealth, success, and recognition that he believed he deserved but had been cheated out of by a system rigged against him. When he learned that Melcher had moved out, he decided to use the house as the site for murders that would shock the world and announce the beginning of Helter Skelter. What they discovered about the planning of the Tate murders reveals the calculated nature of these crimes and the specific instructions that Manson gave to his followers about how to carry out the killings and stage the crime scene. He chose Charles Tex Watson to lead the mission because Watson had proven himself willing to commit violence and had the physical strength and cold-blooded determination needed to overpower multiple victims. He selected Susan Atkins and Patricia Krenwinkel to accompany Watson because they had demonstrated complete loyalty to him and had participated in the torture of Gary Hinman without showing any remorse or hesitation. Linda Kasabian was included in the group even though she had only been with the family for a few weeks, partly because she had a valid driver's license and could serve as the getaway driver, but also because Manson wanted to test her loyalty and complete her transformation from suburban housewife to dedicated family member. Kasabian's inclusion in the murder mission would ultimately prove to be Manson's biggest mistake, as her revulsion at the violence and her willingness to testify against her former companions would provide prosecutors with the evidence they needed to secure convictions. On the evening of August 8, 1969, Manson gathered his chosen killers and gave them their final instructions for the mission that would make them infamous. He told them to go to the house on Cielo Drive and kill everyone they found, making the murders as gruesome and shocking as possible to maximize their impact on society. He specifically instructed them to write messages in blood that would implicate black revolutionary groups and help trigger the race war he believed was necessary for his rise to power. The killers left Spawn Ranch around 10 p.m., driving Linda Kasabian's yellow Ford to the exclusive Benedict Canyon neighborhood where movie stars and music industry executives lived behind gates and security systems. They parked at the bottom of the hill and walked up the winding driveway, with Watson carrying a .22 caliber revolver and all four of them armed with knives that Manson had provided for the mission. The isolation of the house and the late hour meant that the killers could work without fear of being interrupted or discovered until their gruesome task was complete. The first victim was Stephen Parent, an 18-year-old who worked at a stereo shop and had been visiting the caretaker at the guest house to try to sell him a clock radio. Parent was leaving the property when the killers arrived, and he had the misfortune of encountering Watson at the electronic gate that controlled access to the driveway. Watson shot him 4 times through the window of his white Rambler, killing him instantly and demonstrating the cold-blooded efficiency that Manson had trained into his followers through months of psychological conditioning and practice violence. After cutting the phone lines to prevent the victims from calling for help, the killers made their way to the main house where they found Sharon Tate, Ye Sebring, Abigail Folger, and Wojtek Frykowski enjoying what should have been a quiet evening together. The victims were completely unprepared for the nightmare that was about to unfold, and as they lived in a world where such random violence was almost unimaginable, and the idea that strangers would break into their home to commit murder seemed like something from a horror movie rather than real life. The violence that followed was extraordinary in its brutality and demonstrated the complete dehumanization of the victims in the minds of their killers. Watson immediately took control of the situation, ordering everyone to lie on the floor while Atkins and Krenwinkel tied them up with rope that they had brought for the purpose. When Jay Sebring tried to protect Sharon Tate, Watson shot him in the chest and then kicked him in the face, showing the casual cruelty that Manson had instilled in his followers through months of training and psychological manipulation. The killers then began the systematic torture and murder of their victims, stabbing them repeatedly while ignoring their pleas for mercy and their desperate attempts to reason with their attackers. Sharon Tate, who was 8.5 months pregnant, begged for the life of her unborn child, but Susan Atkins later described feeling no sympathy or remorse as she held the actress down and stabbed her 16 times. The killers seemed to take pleasure in the suffering they were inflicting, laughing and making jokes while their victims died in agony. Abigail Folger and Wojtek Frykowski attempted to escape but were hunted down and killed in the yard surrounding the house, and with Watson pursuing them like a predator stalking wounded prey. Folger was stabbed 28 times and Frykowski was shot twice and stabbed 51 times, indicating the frenzied nature of the attack and the killer's complete loss of any normal human inhibitions against violence. The fact that they continued stabbing and beating their victims long after they were dead reveals the extent to which Manson had turned them into instruments of pure destruction. Before leaving the scene, the killers followed Manson's instructions to write a message in blood that would implicate black revolutionaries and help trigger the race war that was central to his delusional worldview. Susan Atkins used Sharon Tate's blood to write "pig" on the front door of the house, a reference to the Beatles' song "Piggies," which Manson interpreted as a call for revolution against the establishment. The killers then returned to Spahn Ranch, where they reported to Manson about their successful completion of the mission he had assigned them. But the story doesn't end there, because Manson was disappointed that the Tate murders hadn't immediately triggered the racial violence he had predicted, so he decided to take personal control of the next mission to ensure that it would be shocking enough to accomplish his goals. On the night of August 9, 1969, he gathered another group of followers and led them to the Los Feliz home of Leno and Rosemary LaBianca, a middle-aged couple who owned a successful chain of grocery stores and represented exactly the kind of establishment figures that Manson believed needed to be eliminated. The selection of the LaBiancas as victims demonstrates the truly random nature of these murders and Manson's complete disregard for human life in service of his grandiose delusions. The couple had no connection whatsoever to Manson, his followers, or anyone involved in the previous night's murders. They were simply unlucky enough to live in a house that Manson had chosen almost at random while driving through their neighborhood looking for suitable targets. Their deaths served no purpose beyond Manson's desire to create more shock and terror that he believed would finally trigger the race war he had been predicting. This time Manson entered the house personally and tied up the victims himself, demonstrating his hands-on involvement in the crimes and his willingness to take direct action when he felt his followers hadn't been sufficiently effective. He spent several minutes with Leno and Rosemary LaBianca, possibly explaining to them why they were going to die or simply enjoying their terror before leaving Watson, Crenwyn Cale, and Leslie Van Houten to carry out the actual murders while he waited in the car with other family members. The LaBianca murders were even more ritualistic and symbolic than the Tate killings, with the perpetrators carving the word "war" into Leno LaBianca's chest and stabbing him multiple times in the throat with a knife and fork that they left protruding from his body. They wrote "Death to Pigs," "Rise," and "Helter Skelter" on the walls in the victim's blood, misspelling the Beatles song title that had become Manson's rallying cry for revolution. They also left a fork in Leno's stomach and covered both victims' heads with pillowcases, creating a crime scene so bizarre and horrific that even experienced homicide detectives were shocked by what they discovered. The systematic nature of the violence and the ritualistic elements of the crime scene reveal the extent to which Manson had programmed his followers to carry out his specific vision of apocalyptic terrorism. The killers weren't acting in the heat of passion or under the influence of drugs. They were methodically following instructions that had been drilled into them through months of psychological conditioning and practice sessions. The fact that they took time to shower and eat food from the LaBianca's refrigerator after committing the murders shows their complete lack of empathy and their transformation into instruments of Manson's will. What makes these murders even more chilling when you examine the evidence and testimony is that none of the actual killers had any personal motive for the violence. They were simply following orders from a man who had systematically destroyed their ability to think independently or feel compassion for other human beings. The transformation of these young people from seemingly normal individuals into remorseless killers represents one of the most successful examples of mind control and behavioral modification in criminal history, demonstrating the terrifying power that charismatic psychopaths can wield over vulnerable individuals. The investigation that followed was initially hampered by the Los Angeles Police Department's failure to recognize the connections between the Tate and LaBianca murders, despite the obvious similarities in the crime scenes and the messages written in blood. The detectives working the Tate case focused on theories involving drug deals gone wrong or revenge killings related to the victims' Hollywood connections, while those investigating the LaBianca murders pursued leads related to organized crime and business disputes. This fragmented approach allowed Manson and his followers to remain free for months while continuing to commit additional crimes and plan further acts of violence. The breakthrough in the case came not through brilliant detective work, but through the sheer arrogance and inability to keep quiet that characterized several of the family members, particularly Susan Atkins, who was arrested on an unrelated charge and couldn't resist bragging to her cellmates about her role in the murders. Atkins described in graphic detail how she had killed Sharon Tate and claimed to have tasted her blood, boasting about the terror she had seen in her victim's eyes and expressing no remorse for the brutal murder of a pregnant woman and her unborn child. The cellmate who reported Atkins' confessions to authorities was Virginia Graham, a middle-aged woman who was serving time for passing bad checks and was horrified by what she heard from the young killer. Graham's decision to contact police potentially saved countless lives, as Manson and his followers were planning additional murders and had discussed targeting other celebrities and public figures as part of their campaign to trigger Helter Skelter. The family had prepared lists of potential victims including Elizabeth Taylor, Frank Sinatra, and Tom Jones, and had conducted surveillance of their homes in preparation for future attacks. The arrest of the Manson family members led to one of the most sensational trials in American legal history, with the defendants using the courtroom as a stage for their bizarre beliefs and disruptive behavior that provided the public with unprecedented insight into the psychology of cult followers and the methods used by charismatic leaders to control their disciples. The trial became a media circus that captivated the nation and changed how Americans thought about crime, violence, and the potential for evil hiding behind facades of youth and innocence. Charles Manson's behavior during the trial demonstrated his continuing ability to manipulate and control his followers, even while incarcerated and facing the death penalty. When he carved an X into his forehead on the first day of testimony, claiming he had X'd himself out of society, his female co-defendants immediately mimicked the action, showing that his psychological hold over them remained intact despite months of separation and the overwhelming evidence of their guilt. Later, when Manson changed the X into a swastika, the women followed suit, revealing the extent to which their individual identities had been subsumed into his twisted worldview. The female defendants' behavior throughout the trial was both fascinating and horrifying to observers, as they sang songs, laughed at inappropriate moments, made threatening gestures toward witnesses and court personnel, and showed absolutely no remorse for their actions or sympathy for their victims. Their complete lack of normal human emotions and their robotic devotion to Manson provided compelling evidence for the prosecution's argument that they had been programmed to kill, and that their leader bore ultimate responsibility for the murders, even though he hadn't personally wielded the weapons. Prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi faced the unprecedented challenge of proving that a defendant was guilty of murders he hadn't personally committed, requiring him to demonstrate how Manson had used psychological manipulation and mind control to turn his followers into instruments of his will. The case required innovative legal theories about conspiracy and the nature of criminal responsibility when dealing with cult dynamics and programmed followers who claimed they were acting of their own free will, while clearly following the orders of their charismatic leader. The key to the prosecution's success was the testimony of Linda Kasabian, who had been present during both nights of murder, but had not participated in the actual killings and had been horrified by what she witnessed. Kasabian's decision to cooperate with authorities and testify against her former companions provided crucial evidence about Manson's planning and control of the murders, his specific instructions to the killers, and his stated goal of starting a race war through acts of spectacular violence that would be blamed on black militants. Kasabian's testimony revealed the methodical nature of Manson's planning and the systematic way he had prepared his followers for violence through months of psychological conditioning, drug use, and exposure to increasingly extreme rhetoric about the coming apocalypse. Her account of life at Spawn Ranch and the gradual process by which ordinary young people were transformed into killers provided the jury with a window into the mechanics of mind control and the devastating effectiveness of Manson's manipulation techniques. The trial concluded with death sentences for Manson, Watson, Atkins, Krenwinkel, and Van Houten, though these were later commuted to life imprisonment when California temporarily abolished the death penalty in 1972. The verdicts were seen as justice for the victims and their families, but they also marked the end of an era of American innocence and the beginning of a new awareness of the potential for random violence and the existence of evil that could not be explained by traditional motives of greed, revenge, or passion. The impact of the Manson murders on American culture extended far beyond the immediate horror of the crimes themselves, fundamentally changing how people thought about safety, celebrity, and the dark potential of the counterculture movement that had promised peace and love, but had produced some of the most shocking violence in the nation's history. The case introduced America to the concept of cult-related terrorism and demonstrated how charismatic leaders could weaponize vulnerable followers to carry out acts of unprecedented brutality in service of delusional ideologies. The murders also marked a turning point in American attitudes toward the 1960s counterculture movement, as the public began to associate hippies and alternative lifestyles with danger and violence, rather than peace and social progress. The image of young people with long hair and flowers in their hair was forever tainted by the reality that some of the most brutal killers in American history had emerged from the ranks of the peace and love generation, creating a lasting skepticism about utopian movements and communal living arrangements. Law enforcement agencies across the country began developing new protocols for investigating cult-related crimes and recognizing the warning signs of dangerous group dynamics, while mental health professionals started studying the psychology of mind control and the techniques used by charismatic leaders to manipulate and exploit vulnerable individuals. The case became a textbook example of how seemingly normal people could be transformed into instruments of violence through systematic psychological manipulation and social isolation. The Manson family murders continue to fascinate researchers, criminologists, and the general public more than 50 years after they shocked the world because they represent a perfect storm of factors that created an unprecedented criminal conspiracy involving mind control, apocalyptic delusions, and random acts of terrorism that seem to emerge from nowhere and strike at the heart of American society. The case forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about human nature, the power of charismatic leadership, and the thin line that separates civilization from chaos in ways that remain relevant and terrifying today. Charles Manson spent the remaining 48 years of his life in prison, where he continued to attract followers and manipulate journalists, authors, and members of the public who were drawn to his notoriety and wanted to understand how he had managed to convince ordinary people to commit such extraordinary acts of violence. He gave hundreds of interviews over the decades, often contradicting himself and spinning elaborate fantasies about his role in history, but never showing genuine remorse for the murders or acknowledging the real harm he had caused to the victims, their families, and society as a whole. The survivors and family members of the Manson murder victims, led by Sharon Tate's sister, Deborah Tate, spent decades fighting to keep the killers in prison and ensure that the victims were remembered as real people with hopes, dreams, and loved ones, rather than just casualties of a sensational crime story. Their efforts to prevent parole for the perpetrators and educate the public about the lasting impact of these murders serve as a powerful reminder that the consequences of Manson's manipulation extended far beyond the immediate victims to include families, friends, and entire communities that were forever changed by these acts of senseless violence. The parole hearings for the surviving killers became recurring nightmares for the victims' families, who were forced to relive the trauma of the murders every few years, as Watson, Krenwinkel, and Van Houten came up for possible release. Each hearing required family members to appear before parole boards and argue why these killers should remain in prison, describing the ongoing impact of their crimes and the continuing danger they would pose to society if released. Susan Atkins died in prison in 2009 after serving 40 years, but not before being denied parole 13 times, despite claims of finding religion and expressing remorse for her actions. The psychological profiles developed of the Manson family members revealed disturbing patterns that helped experts understand how cult recruitment and indoctrination operates on vulnerable individuals seeking meaning, belonging, and escape from personal trauma. Researchers discovered that Manson specifically targeted people who had experienced childhood abuse, family dysfunction, drug problems, or other factors that made them susceptible to his particular brand of manipulation and control, demonstrating the predatory nature of his recruitment methods. Patricia Krenwinkel's transformation from an overweight, insecure young woman who felt invisible in her middle-class family to a cold-blooded killer willing to torture and murder strangers revealed the devastating effectiveness of Manson's psychological techniques. Her participation in both the Tate and LaBianca murders, including her enthusiastic stabbing of Abigail Folger and her use of the victim's blood to write messages on the walls, demonstrated how completely Manson had erased her individual moral compass and replaced it with his own twisted value system. Leslie Van Houten's case became particularly controversial because she was only 19 years old at the time of the LaBianca murders and had not participated in the Tate killings, leading some to argue that she deserved a chance at rehabilitation and eventual release. However, her active participation in the torture and murder of Rosemary LaBianca, including stabbing the already dead woman repeatedly while laughing about the violence, revealed the depth of her transformation under Manson's influence and the genuine danger she had posed to society. The role of drugs in the Manson family's crimes has been widely misunderstood, with many people assuming that the murders were committed by people who were high on LSD or other substances and therefore not fully responsible for their actions. However, investigation revealed that while Manson used drugs as a tool of control and manipulation, actual killers were relatively sober during the murders and carried them out with methodical precision that demonstrated their complete commitment to Manson's mission rather than drug-induced madness. Manson's use of sex as a tool of control and recruitment was central to his ability to maintain power over his followers and create the kind of psychological dependency that made them willing to kill for him. He orchestrated sexual relationships between family members according to his desires, and used sexual humiliation and degradation as punishment for those who questioned his authority or failed to demonstrate sufficient loyalty to his cause. The sexual dynamics within the family created bonds of shame and complicity that made it difficult for members to leave or seek help from outside authorities. The investigation into the Manson family's activities revealed that they had been involved in numerous other crimes beyond the famous murders, including drug dealing, auto theft, credit card fraud, and armed robbery that helped fund their lifestyle and provided opportunities for Manson to test his followers' willingness to break the law on his behalf. These crimes also served as practice sessions for the more serious violence that would eventually make them infamous, gradually escalating the level of criminal activity and moral transgression that family members were expected to accept and participate in. The failure of various social services and law enforcement agencies to recognize the danger posed by the Manson family, despite numerous warning signs and opportunities for intervention, highlights the inadequacy of existing systems for dealing with cult-related threats and the need for better training and protocols for identifying and disrupting dangerous group dynamics. Social workers, parole officers, and police had multiple contacts with Manson and his followers in the months leading up to the murders, but failed to recognize the escalating danger or take effective action to prevent the tragic outcome. The media coverage of the Manson trial and its aftermath created a template for sensationalizing cult-related crimes that continues to influence how these cases are reported and understood by the public. The focus on Manson's bizarre behavior and apocalyptic beliefs often overshadowed the systematic nature of his crimes and the sophisticated psychological techniques he used to control his followers, creating a distorted understanding of cult dynamics that emphasizes the dramatic and sensational rather than the methodical and calculated aspects of these criminal conspiracies. The long-term impact of the Manson murders on the survivors and family members of the victims demonstrates the ripple effects of these crimes that continue to cause pain and trauma decades after the original events. Sharon Tate's mother, Doris, spent the rest of her life advocating for victims' rights and working to keep the killers in prison, while other family members struggled with survivors' guilt, post-traumatic stress, and the ongoing media attention that prevented them from moving on with their lives in privacy and peace. The influence of the Manson case on popular culture has been both extensive and problematic, inspiring countless books, movies, documentaries, and television shows that often romanticize or sensationalize the crimes while failing to adequately honor the memory of the victims or understand the serious lessons that should be learned from these tragic events. The continued fascination with Manson and his followers has sometimes overshadowed the real human cost of their actions and the ongoing suffering of those affected by their crimes. The security changes implemented by celebrities and wealthy individuals following the Manson murders fundamentally altered the landscape of Hollywood and other exclusive communities, as gates, guards, and surveillance systems became standard features of homes that had previously been relatively open and accessible. The murders destroyed the sense of safety and innocence that had characterized much of American society in the 1960s, and introduced a new awareness of the potential for random violence that continues to influence how people think about personal security and public safety. The religious and philosophical elements of Manson's belief system revealed the dangerous potential for apocalyptic thinking and racial hatred to motivate extreme violence, providing insights that remain relevant for understanding contemporary forms of domestic terrorism and hate-motivated crime. His combination of Christian end-times theology, racist ideology, and personal megalomaniacal delusions created a toxic worldview that justified any level of violence in service of his perceived divine mission to reshape society according to his twisted vision. The failure of the criminal justice system to adequately address the warning signs displayed by Manson throughout his life, including his extensive history of manipulation, violence, and criminal behavior, highlights the challenges of predicting and preventing the kind of escalating criminal activity that can lead to mass violence. His repeated cycles of incarceration and release, combined with the inadequate supervision and support provided during his times in the community, created opportunities for him to develop his manipulation skills and recruit the followers who would eventually carry out his murderous plans. The international attention focused on the Manson case helped establish it as a defining moment in American criminal history and a symbol of the dark potential lurking beneath the surface of social movements and cultural changes, influencing how people around the world understood American society and the challenges facing modern democratic systems in dealing with extremist threats and cult-related violence. Today, more than 50 years after these murders shocked the world and forever changed American culture, the Manson case continues to serve as a cautionary tale about the dangers of charismatic leadership, the vulnerability of people searching for meaning and belonging, and the need for vigilance in recognizing and responding to the early warning signs of dangerous group dynamics before they escalate into violence and tragedy. The victims Sharon Tate, Jay Sebring, Abigail Folger, Wojtek Frykowski, Stephen Parent, Leno and Rosemary LaBianca, and Gary Hinman deserve to be remembered, not just as casualties of Manson's madness, but as real people whose lives had value and meaning beyond their tragic ends, and whose deaths should continue to motivate efforts to understand, prevent, and respond to the kind of evil that can emerge when manipulation, hatred, and delusion combine to create instruments of destruction disguised as seekers of truth and agents of change.